Religion has, throughout history, served as a beacon of hope for the underprivileged peoples of society. A key example being that of Moses freeing the Israelites from the Pharaoh in Egypt, freeing them from being slaves. Jesus himself represented the marginalized.
The history of anti-slavery really starts with the Quakers. So the Quakers are a unique religious sect. The Quaker movement started in England with a man named George Fox. It came out of radical religious movements, out of the Protestant Reformation, groups that most people haven't heard of, groups like the Diggers, the Levelers, these religious organizations that really sought to remake the world. And the Quakers were part of that. They were different, but they took their mission to try to change the world with them when they colonized into the New World. And it was really not until the 1740s, the 1750s, the 1760s, that a few Quakers, a man named John Woolman, a man named Benjamin Lay, and a few others, first tried to get rid of slavery within the Quaker movement themselves. The Brown brothers, Brown University, is named after two brothers who were Quakers and who were also both slave traders. So the Quakers had been deeply involved in their religious movement, but in the fight to essentially get slavery out of the Quaker community, the Quakers' initial fight to purify themselves became, by the 1760s, 1770s, an attempt to purify the entire world. And so the anti-slavery movement really, I mean, it begins with the resistance of slaves, but as far as Europeans, white people battling slavery, it begins with the Quakers, who were anti-slavery, who were pushing for an end to slavery more than 70 years before the radical abolitionists. And they were outliers. Quakers were unpopular. In the South, where slavery existed, if you were a Quaker, you were going to be harassed, maybe beaten. You would pay higher taxes, and Quakers were really seen as a threat. And their biggest contribution, I think, to the abolitionist movement is that it was through their fight against slavery in places like Virginia, northern North Carolina, and especially in Pennsylvania, that the first abolition laws were passed in the United States. So it was a Quaker organization, or a Quaker-led organization, the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, that really pushed for Pennsylvania to abolish slavery, and also Quakers in New York who pushed for New York State to abolish slavery. But not only was religion important, but churches themselves became the sinews, or the tendons of organization, that abolitionists used both to galvanize support, but also, organizationally. Church reading groups, church letter groups, and those things provided the basis for the early days of abolitionist organization.
Whether it be the black churches or white churches, they tended to all do kind of similar kinds of things in terms of basic assistance to runaways. They hid them oftentimes on the church property. They fed them. Usually, if there were medical needs, they provide medical care. They provide transport elsewhere. One of the things in the black churches that they did more than the white churches is they also became sources of information to the community. For instance, there's a famous case in 1846 where there were a bunch of slave catchers that showed up in Detroit looking for particular people that were alleged to be runaways, and the easiest way to get the information out was to announce it from the pulpit, all three of the black church pulpits on a Sunday morning, and immediately people were kind of harassing the slave catchers, posting posters around warning people to look out for them and all this kind of stuff. So it became a kind of source of public information as well. Most people were Protestant, a high percentage were evangelical, and the nature of the beast was such that churches that were involved locally as well as elsewhere in Underground Railroad efforts did carry on correspondence with like-minded, pro-reform, anti-slavery kinds of groups and other denominations.
Black abolitionists like Sojourner Truth or Frederick Douglass, who, although he was born and enslaved in Maryland, of course, made his life in Rochester, New York, for the most part. They were all inheritors of the first wave of emancipation, right? Because emancipation, the end of slavery, took place in two waves. First, in the North, during the early days of the American Revolution, ending in about 1810, and that was really led by Quakers, who sort of fell off as their numbers dwindled in the 19th century, and the abolitionist movement was taken over by evangelical Protestants, but all of whom were inspired by Quakers, and who drew on a long tradition of fighting against slavery that really, in the North America, began with Benjamin Lay and John Woolman, and these very small Quaker sects in Philadelphia.
With the story of the Great Exodus, it is always told from the perspective of the Jews and Moses. Yet, if we are to look at it from the perspective of the Egyptian people, it is some of the most heinous crimes against humanity were committed onto the Egyptians, specifically the plagues. John Brown was born May 9th, 1800, in Torrington, Connecticut. He was born to Owen Brown, a very wealthy cattle breeder who was incredibly pro-abolitionism. Owen Brown was a very religious man, and those early religious influences were what created John Brown as the man he is in the mid-1800s.
Religion had a huge impact on John Brown. John Brown was a very devout Christian, kind of in his own particular brand of Christianity, and I think he was very influenced by kind of his understanding of the Old Testament. After Elijah Lovejoy's killing by a pro-slavery mob in 1837 in Alton, Illinois, that really motivated Brown. In fact, he went into his local church and said that he was inspired, and I think religiously inspired, to do whatever he can from that point onward to fight slavery. Brown almost took on the persona of like an Old Testament prophet and saw himself in that role, and others saw him in that role, and long beard and all.
People like William Lloyd Garrison, people like the Bishop Richard Allen, who is the founder of the first African American church, the Bethel AME Church in Philadelphia. All of them, and even the man who wrote Amazing Grace, John Newton, all of them describe their coming to see slavery as a sin, as a religious conversion experience, as part of almost, what we might today consider being born again. As part of sort of accepting a new role for themselves as what John Brown called a holy warrior.
In Brown's case, I think it was the runaway slaves, the capture of runaway slaves, and seeing that in tandem with what he already understood religiously to suggest, I got to do something about this. I can't be, to quote Howard Zinn, I can't be neutral on a moving train.
Brown, having lived most of his life in the North, although Brown knew and interacted with and lived with a lot of free people of color, including runaway slaves, Brown always sort of viewed his mission as divine vengeance, as divine wrath.
The Potawatomi Massacre is arguably a selfish massacre in the sense that John Brown had a warrant out on his head, and the Doyle family was tasked with taking John Brown in. John Brown took his sons down to Potawatomi Creek, knocked on the Doyle family door, and in front of Miss Doyle, murdered the males of the Doyle family.
Frederick Douglass and John Brown met multiple times in the early 1850s, when Frederick Douglass had moved to Rochester, New York, had began printing the North Star, and had become by far the most famous black person in North America.
And they certainly resonated to each other. Brown at that point was only beginning kind of tangentially to push towards violence.
And so, as two famous men moving within the same movement, they had a long relationship, but they disagreed on a lot of key things. Douglass never agreed with Brown about the wisdom of actually invading Harper's Ferry to go up. As a matter of fact, at one point, when they met, maybe in the meeting with George D. Baptiste, Douglass warned him, "This is suicide, Brown. Harper's Ferry is a steel trap. You will never get out."
Harper's Ferry was John Brown's attempt at realizing his dream. The extreme measures which John Brown takes were ultimately what led to his downfall. Should John Brown be considered a martyr or a terrorist?
He clearly, saw himself as an instrument of divine vengeance. And, just as Christ was martyred, he viewed himself as like a Christ-like figure, even if he was born. He understood, and I think, he understood that he was going to die, and he understood that his impact would come after he was hanged for treason. And keep in mind, too, when the Union Army marched off to battle in the Civil War, they were singing a song, Battle Hymn of the Republic, that was based on a slave song about John Brown that had the line, which describes this a lot. He frightened old Virginia. He frightened old Virginia, something through and through. They hung him for a traitor, even though they the traitor crew. Because that just said, to Virginians he was a traitor, he was a treasonous terrorist, but to people in Boston, to people in Rochester, New York, to many people even in Michigan, he was a hero. I have a quote, that William Lloyd Garrison said, right, that John Brown, all he did was tell the time, by which he means what John Brown did and his raid, which was terrorism, right? I mean, if someone brought a band of 20 armed people, took hostages, took over a government facility, murdered several people, and then fired and engaged in a gun battle with the U.S. Army, I think most people today would consider that terrorism. But it was terrorism for a cause that we also today would think was just, would think was right. And half of the country almost thought so then too, and half of the country did not.